I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. In this episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, let's welcome Elaine Miller-Karas, who's the author of Building Resilience to Trauma, the Trauma and Community Resiliency Models, and also the executive director and co-founder of the Trauma Resource Institute. All right. We are ready to start up another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast. And I'm particularly pleased today to be welcoming a guest, a woman that I've had the privilege of meeting at the most recent Transformational Resilience Innovation Group conference up in Portland a couple months ago. And this is, I believe, we're looking at December 30th, 2017, that we're talking together now. And my guest today is Elaine Miller-Karas. And Elaine, you have created quite a body of work. And this whole body of work that includes, like yourself and the agencies that you've created and that you are a part of, there's a handful of agencies that have really created a remarkable set of tools that seem to be especially potent for people to be able to learn quickly, experience quickly, and then if they so desire, they can turn around and bring that same tool set to other people in their family and their social network. And this is exactly the kind of toolkit that I've been looking for in terms of what the Poetry of Predicament is about, my book, The Impossible Conversation, which is the notion that we are facing not only vexing problems in our world, but predicaments. And that's an order of magnitude more hefty a situation to be facing. So rather than me trying to recount all the different aspects of your body of work and the organizations that you're involved with, I'm hoping that you would introduce yourself and give us a rundown of who you are and what the agencies that you are involved with do. And more than anything, welcome Elaine Miller-Karas to the Poetry of Predicament. Hi.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'll tell you a little bit about myself and what I've been up to for the last few years. So I am currently the executive director and the founder of the Trauma Resource Institute. And our mission is to bring our very simple healing modalities that I've been part of the creation of to the world community, one person at a time, kind of one step at a time, one person at a time. And also in the models that we've created, we felt it's really important to imbue it with the cultural lens of the community that we're going into. And that's not for us to do, but for the community to do. So our models can be used cross-culturally, and we've been to many places around the world in sharing these models. But when you talk about the predicaments and also some of the larger traumatic experiences that are happening in the world, our models are proving to be very effective. And the one that I guess that's dearest to my heart at this moment in time is called the Community Resiliency Model. And this is really for the world, and it's for the natural leaders, which may or may not be professionals, but could be the person who lives at the end of your street, who everybody goes to when there's a problem because she or he tends to have a lot of wisdom on how to approach the problems in the world. And so what we wanted to do with those natural leaders that exist around the world, which is really part of our humanity as human beings, is that how could we also deliver a group of skills that could help them establish greater well-being, not only in themselves, but like you said, for their family and their wider community. And so with the community resiliency model, it's also based upon cutting edge neuroscience, but it's a very simple application of cutting edge neuroscience that even a child could share it with another child. And it has to do with the amazing, what I call elegant design of the human nervous system and how we are designed. For example, that if there is a tiger that comes into my room, I would have a pretty big response to that, right? I might run out of my room. I might freeze. I might, if I felt strong enough, maybe fight that animal. But there would be something happening in terms of my reaction to my nervous system. And so there's two parts of the nervous system, which we call the accelerator and the brake, or the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, that we teach people to pay attention to. And so our model, very simply, is we teach people how to read their autonomic nervous system and tell the difference between sensations of distress and sensations of well-being. And being able to tell that difference opens up the world of understanding what happens to you on the inside. And then what's miraculously apparent to us is that that gives people choice. Well, if I know that every time that I turn on the news and hear the current state of affairs of the news, my heartbeat starts to beat fast and I start feeling tense muscles and I'm tense, I'm reading my nervous system and I have a choice. Do I want to stay like that? Or do I want to be what we call go into our best self, our state of well-being, so that maybe I can take in this information and make better decisions, not only for myself, but others, or maybe even how I want to take action that comes from the best part of my mind, body, and spirit. So we have some very simple skills. When you read the nervous system, I can say, well, where in my body do I feel better right now? And it could be as simple as saying, I feel better in my legs. And if I bring attention to that, and I feel the sturdiness of my legs and bring my attention to my feet on the ground, I all of a sudden take a deeper breath, a parasympathetic breath, and I can feel the tension slowly leaving my body. And then I can pay attention to that. And what we know about neuroscience is that brain cells that fire together wire together. And so the more that I pay attention to my well-being, do you think that's going to expand? Of course. And so when my well-being expands, that means I can handle those stresses of listening to the news or some of the bigger things that happen in our lives. Maybe when we lose someone who's close to us, or when we experience things that are unspeakable, like some of the horrible natural disasters that have happened in the last couple of months in our world. And that's one of the ways that we met. One of the organizations that I've been involved with is the Transformational Resilience Coalition. That I've been a part of it since it started, and I'm very happy to say that the Trauma Resource Institute has been one of the founding members of that organization. So when you talk about one of the agencies, when I first met Bob Doppelt, I was very excited to meet him and his ideas, because we know that there is a psychological toll that happens to us as human beings when our houses are swept away, when there's an earthquake, when the climate changes to such a degree where now we're experiencing drought, where we once had, a wonderful cycle of rain that we could grow our crops. And so I was really interested in that, because in our community resiliency model, one of the questions you asked me was, how we brought it to the world. I've been asked by many organizations to come in after a natural disaster and bring in our model to help the people who have been traumatized by it, to train natural leaders to be trainers or teachers of this model. So then when we leave a place in the world, they can then teach others. So it's what we do to build capacity. And you've heard that old adage, I don't want to give them the fish. I want to teach them how to fish. And that really can change communities. And that's one of the things we're doing.
Right. Well, when I started the research in my book, The Impossible Conversation, one of the first studies that I bumped into was was done by Lisa Van Susteren, who I know is also a founding member of that Transformational Resilience Coalition.
And she's a passionate lady. If you haven't,
Yeah,
really
she's a
cool.
remarkable person, and the gist that I recall from that study was that she and some other researchers projected out the numbers that they anticipated of Americans that would be suffering some sort of chronic or acute emotional, psychological distress as a result of the collapse of systems, which I think at the pinnacle of that is, of course, climate change and so on. And their estimate ran in the neighborhood of 200 million people. Now, we've already got a mental health system in this country that is overtaxed and completely inadequate to the task, just the way things stand right now, which we still are in a fairly privileged bubble, even after a horrid track record like 2017 brought us in terms of natural disasters and fires and so on. I don't think we've gotten anywhere near the 200 million mark that they were pointing to and so on, that threshold. But clearly what showed up for me in reading that report a couple of years ago now was I just saw this is a time like no other in human history. And if we don't have some kind of expansion of our capacities and skills as human beings, that we don't stand a chance. That communities, families, nations don't stand a chance, given how ill prepared we are and how low our average capacity is. The capacity is of the average person to be aware of, present to, and not to mention have skills to address those kind of waves of stressors. And just to go back to, you mentioned Bob Doppelt, and one thing in his book, Transformational Resilience, excuse me, that particularly impressed me was he really was one of the first authors that I read that really wasn't afraid to estimate that we would be having large-scale stressors one after the other. That our history has implied that, it'll always be that there'll be a big hurricane and it'll take years to come back, but that's what the community will do for those years and it'll be fine. But he was saying and estimating that, no, it looks like we're going to be up for some wave after wave after wave with possibly no gap between. And I'll be darned if we didn't get 2017 and its chain of natural disasters. So this is my long-winded way of saying I'm extremely excited about the accessibility of the models that you're talking about. And I want to go into some of the specifics if you'll take us there. And I'm also, what's implied for me about through that accessibility is it's so apparently easy to scale.
Yes, and I think that's what we have been, really humbled by. And I think what you're saying about just the scope of how many people, one of the ways that this model was really developed was after the earthquake in Haiti. And in Haiti, we had another model called the trauma resiliency model. We still have it, but it's really geared toward mental health professionals. And I could see when we were there, and also in the work that I've done in a county that's near my home, San Bernardino County, that there was so much need, and that if you're going to you're going to share something and teach something that people can embrace, and there's so much need, it has to be fairly simple, easy to learn. And I call it, that our model is very adaptable and transportable and accessible. Mm-hmm. And just those things that you said, because if there's that many millions of people that need help, and we're talking about, emotional help, psychological help. First of all, many people on the globe are not psychologically oriented. They would never go to see a mental health professional. but they would go to that wise person that lives at the end of their street. And that's what really captured my heart, my mind. And how can we take that natural ability that people have and help them with some wellness skills and learn them to actually add to their toolbox so they can even be more effective in reducing some of the effects of trauma and stress that are happening because of this one after another experiences that we've saw in 2017. I just saw something about Puerto Rico where they said FEMA said something to the effect where people are going to have to start making their own preparations, because I don't think that we have the resources when we have, which I think is clear with what's happening in Puerto Rico, when we have something that happens so quickly after two other major hurricanes. And if what we believe about climate change, this is not an anomaly, but something that we're going to see more in the future.
Yeah.
So I think that our model of going into a community and teaching the natural leaders to be teachers of the model, because then that one person, how many people can they teach, right? They could teach 1,000 people in their friendship networks. Mm-hmm. Right now, we have a research being done, of course, by academic institutions outside of the Trauma Resource Institute. And one of them is Loma Linda University. They have gone many places with us around the world and done pre and post tests of the work that we've done after disasters. And what we've seen is, first of all, that people feel at the end of the only a 5-day training, they feel capable and ready to start teaching the skills to others. Mm-hmm. But the other thing that we've seen is that not only do they, of course, teach it to others, they use it for themselves. And I mean, there's not many models that we can say, oh, well, this is something you can help someone else with, but it's something that you can use for yourself. But the exciting thing that we're seeing in the research is that we're seeing statistically significant reductions in depression, anxiety, in some of the post-traumatic stress symptoms. In one of the studies that was done in San Bernardino County, we saw reductions in hostility indicators and somatic symptoms. So these studies are now being, they're surveys, they've been replicated, and now there are a number of studies being done in different places around the country and the world that are what we call randomized controlled trials. So comparing different groups who've had the dosage of the model and those who haven't, and to see if what we're seeing is holding up from what the surveys that we've done after natural disasters. So that work is being done right now, and the preliminary evidence that's been shared with me is that they're seeing similar effects. Yes. So that's exciting, because if that's how simple it can be to learn how to read your nervous system, because you see, there's also something a little bit different about this, and this is where our Western paradigm, and in many other cultures, people say, oh, you have to talk about the trauma in order to heal from the trauma. Well, what we've learned is that's not necessarily the case. For some people, talking about what happened to them actually makes them worse, and they feel worse. And it's almost like in our culture, we have hamsters, right? You see the hamster in the wheel, and he doesn't get off the wheel. He keeps going round and round and round. It's almost like they keep telling the story round and round and round. They never get off. But what happens to the nervous system when we tell the story over and over again? Are we in a state of calm? Many times not. We start experiencing within the body the same sensations that happened during the time of the trauma. Heartbeat starts beating fast, tense muscles, maybe even having the emotions of fear and distress. But when we can shift it with the body and start to work with this inherent elegant design and have the body work with us rather than against us, then it actually has the amazing effect of, we call it bottom up, is once you start working in this way and tracking your own nervous system, your thoughts start changing, and you start having more thoughts about well-being. Your thoughts start changing to what you can do proactively to not only change your own life, but maybe contribute to your community's change. And so there is that ripple effect that is quite powerful. I want to share one thing with you that hopefully will be published this coming year. The Loma Linda team work with an organization called ADRA International, which is the Adventist Disaster Relief Agency. And so they're the trauma team for this large international organization that has hospitals and communities all over the world. So they were very much involved in Sierra Leone. And after the Sierra Leone Ebola crisis, they went and delivered the teachings of the community resiliency model. Because at that point, when they first arrived, what they shared with me is that people were in such a state of shock. It was even hard for them to bring in new information. They were in such a state of shock. But then they went back a few months later, and of that first group of people that they trained, they took 20 of them and they taught them to be teachers. But what they saw in just the few months that in between the two trainings is the change in the individuals. And what they shared with the teaching team from Loma Linda was how the skills had begun to change them. They were so excited by it that they were so ready and able at that point to be really active listeners, to start learning the model to teach it to others. What's exciting about this particular study is that the Loma Linda team is following the generation that's been taught the skills from the first trainers in Sierra Leone. And they're seeing the same results in terms of statistically significant changes from the natural leaders of that community teaching their own people. Mm. Won't that be the most effective? You know, I often say, you know, my mom was a really spunky gal. She was from El Salvador, and she came to this country, you know, really without speaking English. And she married my dad, who was a farmer from Montana. And I was raised in the California, San Francisco Bay Area. But my mom wouldn't have been the kind of person that would have sought out a psychologist, even though there were times, like in anybody's life, that she would have needed it. But she was very Catholic. And if the Catholic priest would have said to her, Elsie, there's a great course that we're offering at the church, and it's about wellness skills that you can learn to help your family be stronger, she would have been the first person to sign up for that. But if someone would have said, there's a psychologist or a therapist like myself coming, I'm a licensed clinical social worker, by the way, coming, and we're going to talk to you about trauma and teach you how to reduce the impacts of the traumas that you have in your life, I don't think she would have gone to that. First of all, she wouldn't have self-identified as a person having trauma. So she would have just said, oh, those are the windstorms of life, which is how many people view some of the traumatic stress reactions that they have. So in any event, I think this part of accessibility, like you mentioned, is a very important part of what we do, to try to bring as many people in to learn about wellness skills, to share it with their community, that we're seeing from the academic research is having a big impact.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Your sharing really leads me to ask, if I was an example of someone who's been through at least a first level training, and perhaps even train the trainer situation like you've been describing, if I've put some of these practices into place in my life, what would that look like? What would I be doing in a day that would help me out?
Well, I love that you asked me that question. So one of the things that became clear to me is that the wellness skills of the community resiliency model are about the activities of daily living. You know, when there's such a big thing about resilience right now, and my definition of resilience is really a person's ability to tap into their own interpersonal strengths and their community strengths in order to thrive while managing the activities of daily living. And so that's what we want to do, isn't it? But if we've had things happen to us, we want to be able to take care of our kids. We want to be able to go to the market and buy the groceries to cook meals for our children if we're lucky enough to have that available to us. We want to be able to laugh with our friends. We want to be able to go to church or help our community. And so with the community resiliency model, there's 6 skills. They're very simple. And the skills are something that you could integrate into your activities of daily living. So for example, I'll give you a personal example. So here in Los Angeles, where I live, getting on the freeways and getting stuck in traffic is really not a pleasant thing. I can just even feel myself getting, oh my gosh, if I have to get in there, I get tense. Now if I want to drive the whole time on the freeways like that, I don't feel very good. So what I do now is I'm holding onto the steering wheel. I do something called grounding, which is just paying attention to my body in the present moment. And when I do that and I hold the wheel and I don't grip it, but I just hold it naturally, I take that parasympathetic breath. But what I do now is I notice it. And then if I notice that, then I notice my whole body starts to relax. And now I'm driving without the tension. Now that's a very simple thing, but that also is about our well-being. What happens to us every single day if we drive on the freeways? We see the occasional examples of road rage. I mean, I don't know if you've ever felt angry when you've been driving. I certainly have. Um, but some of us don't have the skills to hold ourselves back. And we then sometimes do things that we will regret that causes harm not only to ourselves but to others. So if we can just integrate that little thing about grounding into our activities of daily living, just imagine how that changes. Or how about your child comes up to you and they're going, "Mommy, Daddy, do this," and you're focused on doing something you have to get done, which may be for work, and you go, "Don't bother me right now," and then all that child's hearing your loud voice. Is that what you want to communicate to your children? But if at that moment you can stop and pause and either ground yourself, or sometimes it's as simple as pushing against the wall and just notice as I push against the wall, okay, I'm back into my zone. We call it the resilient zone or the zone of well-being. Oh, honey, mommy has to do this right now. But you know what? Let's put your toys down here. And as soon as mommy's done with this, we're going to go outside and play. You see, that's a different approach. So that's how you could, in just two simple ways, that you could integrate it into your activities of daily living. But let's say someone has, we're hearing so much in the press right now about just the number of women and men who've been sexually assaulted. And let's say that, you're at the supermarket and all of a sudden you smell a scent of a cologne of someone who had attacked you. You think you're going to go, "Oh, there's that cologne. What is that?" Your body doesn't react that way. Your body has a part of the brain called the amygdala, which is your threat appraiser. And it's saying, "Oh, get out, away from this, you're in danger." So all of a sudden you're tense, you're feeling fear, you want to leave the store. You may not even know why. But if you were able to read your nervous system, you might not know the why yet and say, wait a second, I don't know, I smelled something. But let me just, oh my gosh, I'm going to think about one of my resources. One of my resources could be a beautiful place of nature like the backdrop that I'm looking at right now of the ocean. Okay, that's right. The last time I went to the ocean, it was so nice. Oh, that's right. It smells so good. And all of a sudden, now I'm shifting my awareness in the present moment to a resource that's shifting my nervous system away from the traumatic trigger to a present state of well-being. So then I can go to the supermarket and not leave my basket full of groceries because all of a sudden I felt fear. And that
So
is
some
life-changing.
some amount of this training that I would have received from you and your team would have heightened my awareness of when I'm triggered. What does it feel like? What does it look like? If in the years that have led up to me now, in not having been trained in that, they would be just unconscious triggered behavior. I would just be off to the races doing whatever I do automatically. You're saying that some part of this training is to become aware enough of my own system that if I sense a particular, my heart rate, or I'm sweating, or I feel like we're running away, whatever the symptoms are, I'm more aware of them. And I have a pause button that I can hit to be able to make some choice rather than just being on automatic.
Exactly. And so the other part about that, and the way that we teach that, I'm going to ask you a question right now. Do you have a pleasant memory of a certain smell that when you smell it, it just brings a certain sense of well-being to you?
Sure.
Can you share what that would be?
It was a particular plant in San Diego when I was a kid. And I remember from those moments, I remembered that I love this smell. I'm walking by it as I walk by it every 3 or 4 days. I know it well, and I will remember this for the rest of my life. I was about 10 years old.
Oh, so when you tell me about it right now, and you're even remembering you're in San Diego and walking by it when you were just 10, what happens inside yourself right now? Do you notice anything different about your breathing or your muscle tension, relaxation?
I noticed that there was an ease to starting to tell you the story, and I was smiling, and it was just a pleasant sensation.
So that pleasant sensation, I would say, well, just pay attention to all the sensations that are pleasant on the inside.
Mm-hmm.
And that, number one, the brain cells that are firing together or wiring together, that's a strong memory that we just brought to the present moment.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be something where you could shift your attention. If you were to get one of those triggers that would not be so pleasant, you could shift to that memory, and you practice it enough, it becomes so second nature to you that your body shifts the attention and you experience that sense of well-being.
Mm-hmm.
And what's so exciting about that is that I think it really does change, again, those activities of daily living, that if you have, some people tell me they're surrounded by minefields of triggers because of the numbers of traumas that they've had in their life, but they have not felt like they could manage them or could be in control of them. I remember one woman saying to me right in the beginning when I was starting to do this, Elaine, I'm in charge of it now. It's not in charge of me. Wow. That's just such a big difference, right?
Yeah.
And you can walk through life. We have a young man in Rwanda. His name is Sam Habimana, and he's been trained as a community resiliency model skills teacher. He sends me all sorts of wonderful little stories about the work he's doing in Rwanda. And he was trained just about maybe 19, 20 months ago, and he's trained over 2,000 people in the skills. And he actually has projects going now through the University of Kigali in Rwanda. And he told me a story that I just love. And it's about a woman who survived the genocide in Rwanda. And every day of her life, she had to pass, in order to go to market, a house that was a house of Hutus. She says, we don't talk about Hutus and Tutsis any longer, but I knew they were Hutus. So every day I would go by that house, I would stiffen myself up to get past really quickly. And I would do that over and over again. So there, what was firing inside of her? The tension and distress, the memory of the genocide. But she said to Sam, when she ran into him later, after you taught me the skills, I started reading my nervous system, and I started walking past it, not with attention. And then I found myself feeling more relaxed. And as I walked past one day, the family was out on their lawn, the front porch, and I waved to them. They waved to me, and we smiled. And she goes, now I can go by, and I don't go by with that tension any longer. Now that simple act to me meant so much in a larger scale perspective of how we heal after atrocities. Because if you can have well-being for the perpetrator of the crime, because they have to rebuild their society. There's not the choice of, oh, that person's going to be there. People are getting out of prison who've been in prison from the genocide, right? Mm-hmm. If they can't come together like that, then how can they go forward and have greater healing in their society, which is what Sam talks to me about.
Right.
So he is such a strong advocate for the simple model because he can teach it to so many who may not be psychologically oriented at all. Mm-hmm. So I think it also has implications, learning this model, for, I guess, restorative justice, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. That if we are in our best parts of ourselves, then we have the best capacity to, I think, to have compassion, mm-hmm. not for ourselves, but for others. And, right now in our country, we have had more and more discussions in our trainings about diversity and the issues that have been surfacing in a greater degree in our current social political climate. And that really concerns me, what's happening to our children and about children growing up where they may feel like the other. And I think it's dear to my heart because of my family history of, although I don't look it, that, I would say I'm a Latina and grew up with people in my family of all different colors. in terms of their complexion. And how can we help children, read their nervous systems? So if they're feeling safer, that they can shift their attention to feeling safer. So I think when we look at the broader implications, here we've met regarding our interest in climate change, but it's not only climate change. It's also because what happens with climate change as well is people who are the most marginalized become even more marginalized. People who have assets and money can leave the country, can go to the hotel, buy a new home someplace else, start their careers someplace else. But if you are living in poverty, that's not as available to you. And unfortunately, racism and poverty are something that we see all over the world, not only in our own country.
Elaine, could we do a little recap? I think you mentioned that there were 6 different basic skills that I, as this imaginary student,
Yes.
might pick up and hopefully master. And would you help me remember which ones we've covered so far? There was a grounding, I think.
Yeah. Well, first, and number 1 is reading the nervous system, which is called tracking, or reading the nervous system. And that we use with every single skill, because just like when you were thinking about that pleasant smell from your childhood, that is a resource, which is a second skill. But it's a resource that I also invited you to track, the first skill. So we often teach the skill by first talking about a resource and then tracking the nervous system. Then the third is grounding, like you just mentioned, and grounding is really something that's inherent in many cultures, about bringing your attention to the present moment and paying attention to how, the chair, the wall, the ground is supporting your body. The fourth skill we haven't talked about, but it's called gesturing. And what we've learned as we've gone around the world is there's many healing gestures that people do all over the world that, for some that we've seen, have very similar meanings. Although we don't prescribe meaning, we would ask what it means. For example, this always happens to me when I talk about my granddaughter. I put my hand to my heart. And oftentimes around the world, when people talk about things that are dear to them, they put their hand to their heart. Like in China, after the Sichuan earthquake, I remember sitting in a makeshift dwelling with a woman and asking her about what was helping her to get through these times. And she said, she touched her effigy, jade effigy of the Buddha, and said, "Oh, the teachings of Buddha." And she took a deep breath. And then in Haiti, after the earthquake there, talking to people and I'm saying, "Well, what's helping you through this right now?" "Oh, I have Jesus in my heart." The same breath. So, in our organization, we're not there to prescribe a certain religion or a certain way, but we ask people what is meaningful to them. And the nervous system has a very similar response to what is meaningful to an individual person around the world. And so that is also, I think, a way that we work with gestures to bring attention to them and say, we might say, "Oh, Elaine, I noticed you put your hand to your heart." Now, when I notice that right now, I feel warmth, and I also go into this wonderful natural parasympathetic breath. There's many gestures, but that's one. The fifth skill is called Help Now. And Help Now just are very quick skills that if you are thrust out of that space of your best self, which we call the resilient zone again. We call about the high zone or the low zone. The high zone, you get irritated, you're angry, no one wants to be around you. And the low zone, you feel disconnected, depressed. You just don't even want to get out of bed sometimes. So we want to help people when they're in those states come back into their zone of well-being. And what happens for some people is that they can get so in those states that it's hard for them to resource or ground or even to track. So in those cases, we use we use a number of different things that help to really engage the cortex of your brain. Like we'd say, "Well, can we look around the room for a second and just name the colors of the room? What colors do you see? Is there a color that you like best?" So as people do that, and they're engaging that part of their brain, oftentimes their nervous system will start to soothe and to calm down. We also might use movement, walking around, for example, moving the large muscles of your arms and your legs can also help to bring down the activation of your nervous system if you're high, or bring it back up if you're low. And it could be as simple as pushing against the wall or pushing your back against the wall and really sensing the large muscles of your body. Many people tell me that is a very helpful. And we've worked a lot with people that after, women who've been sex trafficked, veterans, who tell me that particular one is the most helpful. So that's help now. There's 10 altogether. We probably could have named 20, but we have 10 that we've pulled out. And then the last one is called Shift and Stay. And this is, I've talked to you about this one, when the person can shift from that being triggered to that smell that brings fear, and they shift their awareness to maybe that pleasant smell, and then they stay with their sensations of well-being. So that shifting of the nervous system is part of nature. And we can do that with our own nervous system with intention. And that's that's very exciting. So those are the 6 skills. You can see they're very simple. Mm-hmm. And our trainings, our teacher trainings, teach people the skills as well as how to teach them. So at the end of the 5-day training, they can go out and to their own community and start teaching the skills, and even have their own little businesses teaching the skills, and incorporate them not only maybe in the work that they do in the world as their job, or in their community if they belong to a, let's say, a religious congregation. We've trained many people from many different religions with the skills, and what many ministers, rabbis, priests, chaplains have told me, that it can enhance a person's experience of their spiritual natures. Mm-hmm. So that's them. That's the 6. And we have a free app. So anyone that's listening and watching that would like to learn more about the skills can download iChill, ICHILL, on the Android store and the iTunes store. There's also an iChill My Beer. That's not us. We have it's iChill. And we also, there are some people that don't have smartphones. We have ichillapp.com that you could listen to it on the computer.
Yeah. I'm about midway through Building Resilience to Trauma, your book, the subtitle, The Trauma and Community Resiliency Models. And so I imagine that somebody who's really excited to get more of the meat on the bones of this conversation could get that book. And I mentioned before.
Thank you for reminding me about it. I always forget to talk about my book.
Yeah. And by the end of this conversation, we'll get websites and any other contact information from you. But I also just want to mention what hopefully you and I have been talking a bit, and I'm very excited by what you've been sharing about the possible connection with your work and that of Bob Doppelt with transformational resilience. And it seems to me like it's a very potent combination, and you've been talking about the possibility of you and Bob putting together something later in 2018, and even possibly on the West Coast, which is great for me.
We just are starting to germinate the idea. Actually, you were one of the people that sparked it when we talked again in Portland, Oregon. And so Bob and I will be talking about it, and we're hoping to put something together. So I'm sure both of us would be happy to come back and talk with you about it when we're in that place. So yes, so you could go to our website. We do have we will be offering community resiliency model teacher training in the summer. It's not on the website yet, but it will. We're just posting our things for 2018 now.
Yeah.
And it's traumaresourceinstitute.com, and you can learn more about what we're doing around the world from our website. Great.
I know that there will be people in our audience that we're integrating as much of this type of material as we can. My creative partner Carolyn Baker and I put together our own website and online offerings, and also live trainings through our fledgling organization Living Resilience. And
name Living Resilience. That's great.
And I guess what I'd like to do is just for a moment slightly shift the frame, because there's certainly nothing missing in what I hear you describing, and I think it's one of the most valuable skill sets that I could imagine people being exposed to around the world. As you're describing, you name the kind of collective or individual trauma, and this seems to be an extremely useful skill set. But I think the framing that I'd like to offer and invite for perhaps our next conversation, I'm hoping we'll have, this is just the first of many, if I have anything to do with it, is just to bring in this notion of predicament. That's, I think, what sets our work aside from other service organizations. What Carolyn and I, certainly Carolyn far more than I, have been involved with what could be called a collapse-aware community for a number of years now. She's easily the most prolific author that addresses the conversation of who will we be together in the face of these vexing problems and predicaments of our world. And, she's, I just know she's had a tremendous impact for the folks that have enjoyed her books. And every one of her books is chock full of practices and suggestions for ways to integrate this into one's life. As I'm hearing, that's exactly what your work is about as well.
Yes.
What I'm particularly excited about when I hear of folks like yourself and Bob Doppel putting your work together, and just touch back into that point that I made earlier about the waves of stressors that Bob articulates in his book, Transformational Resilience. Obviously, that's what's coming. Obviously, we got the big show of that in 2017, and I believe that is going to be the new normal, and not just about climate change. This is, it actually shifted for me from the thing that originally got me into this study to now it's actually it's probably third or fourth on the list of important metrics of various human or earth systems that are threatening to collapse and or are doing so right now in their own speed. I'm particularly excited because because of the accessibility that you and I have been talking about, the scalability of it, of the body of work, of these simple practices. And if I could just throw in a couple that I'm sure are a part of one way or another woven into your work, but just to be more specific, like a mindfulness practice, if a person is pretty serious about taking on a predicament-laden world and being functional, it seems like there are a number of practices that one would need to have to bolster their world, because we're not kidding around. The things you've been talking about, the communities, the issues that you're talking about are no small thing. And there's a quote that one of my mentors and inspirations in this work, Andrew Harvey, talks in his book called The Hope, in which he articulates what he calls sacred activism. And his point about sacred activism is someone who has dug deep into their own insides, their own heart, their own deep inner reserves, the psycho-spiritual zone and beyond, that oftentimes what ends up happening is a person will tap into what I might call a state of grace. I'm not trying to say I coined the phrase. It just seems like it communicates. And I recall a particularly poignant quote from The Hope, this book from Andrew Harvey, in which he quotes Marion Woodman. And she, if I could just paraphrase, she says, to take on sacred activism, to step forward in this bold way in life, and to not have a set of spiritual practices is as foolish as running into a forest fire wearing only a paper tutu. So what I'm hearing in what you were sharing about just the most basic level practices that I might be able to learn in the methodology that you're talking about. And we add to it, I'm sure, how many dozens and dozens, hundreds, whatever, of other traditions, other methodologies, and equally accessible, fairly easy to install into one's life. But how potently they shift us to being more capable of being present in the face of, and possibly even thriving in the face of, these global predicaments.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to up the scale to, because this is the kind of conversation that I think our audience is used to hearing. It's more than the rather privileged environment that most Americans are in most of the time, where we think trauma or the problems of daily life, the stressors of daily life, seem like they're overwhelming. We all have full plates, we all have full lives, and then add to that any sort of stressor like the ones that 2017 brought us, and we can be deeply overwhelmed. And I guess what I'm trying to point at is that this notion of bringing it to predicament as well can be even more daunting still. So yes, and my wholehearted applause to you, your team, Bob Doppel, Lisa Van Susteren, and the many other folks like you who are building these kind of accessible toolkits. I'm moved and very much appreciating it.
And I'm so glad you brought in the sacred, because I think that is what I have been probably the most humbled by as I've gone to, Tanzania, Nepal, Kenya, the Philippines, Haiti, Iceland, Belfast, Germany, Turkey. I've been to so many places I never imagined. But when people tap into that best self, which I think there's so many different avenues, that there's a sacredness that becomes present, that they can see within themselves that also shines from them. And I think there is something about it being embodied, which I think mindfulness practice does, as well as our community resiliency model wellness skills. And I do think that we need, as human beings, we have to have so many different things in our toolbox that we can bring forward to walk through what, as at best, can be a lot of hardship, right? That we all face. And we do have so much privilege in the US, and I certainly am grateful for it every single day as I travel to different parts of the world. But I guess the other thing I've seen is that although I've been to places where it's hard for me to imagine to live, but there's been also this incredible spirit that I've seen in people that is a richness that has nothing to do with money or power or position, but it has to do with the sacredness that a person can experience within themselves and how that shines forth in their community. That empowers me to continue to do this work that we do, because then that incredible thread that we all have amongst all of us, the spiritual quality, which I think that as much as this is a biological model, it's also a spiritual model, because I think that they're inseparable. To be embodied is to be yes, biological, but it's also to touch into the best parts of your spiritual self.
Thank you for saying what you just said. And there's a part of me that I don't know how much I let on in my earlier comments, but I've never been much of a religious person. It just never offered me any solace, and it's been more of an aggravation than anything else. But what's tremendously ironic is in the past couple of years, as I've been researching the book and these predicaments that we face, I've had some extraordinary, impossible conversations with people who are fundamentalist Christians, a number of evangelicals. I've had extraordinary conversations, with the doorway into those conversations being our ability to share our experience of this thing that we've called grace. Turned out that this non-religious guy over here could share what he's been experiencing, and the person I'm speaking with could share theirs. And it didn't matter that we didn't have the same beliefs or even necessarily values. What we could share was this presence and this experience and the authenticity of that sharing. And there was a bonding that occurred. Like we literally had a wonderful connection and conversation. And I don't think I can count how many times that's happened in the past couple of years. So I'm encouraged by the way this material, these simple practices that are at the center of your work and Bob's and others, they're what's encouraging to me is that I don't have to have a particular belief. I don't have to have identical values to yours. I don't have to have any religious affiliation. And yet I can still find a connection with other people in the room who are very different from myself. I can't imagine something more needed in this particular time in humanity's history.
You said it beautifully. I couldn't say it better myself. I think that, this is what we need in our country and the world right now, because if we keep living in the polar extremes, then we're not going to get into what you call the state of grace, the state of connection. And how do we get into those states of grace? You've been on a journey the last couple of years, and I think there's many ways, there's many roads up that mountain of getting into that state of grace. But I think when we can see the commonalities that we have rather than the differences, which is what you so sweetly said, and of course, the vehicle that I've been working with so intently is this elegant design of the human nervous system, because we all got it. Whether we live in Tanzania, England, Oregon, California, Japan, we all have a nervous system that responds very similarly when we are in states of grace about the things that have meaning to us. So, with that, I don't know if there's anything more that we can say today.
I don't think there is more to say today. Elaine, it's just been a complete and utter pleasure to have you here with us. And I really look forward to whatever connecting we can do around the trainings you might offer this coming year. I really hope you'll come back and speak with me and us again soon. I'd like to go in particular directions if we get future conversations together that more address that predicament side of the conversation a bit more specifically. And I just, more than anything, would like to thank you for your work, because if it's anything like the work that I've been doing for quite some time in a particular brand of the training industry that I've been in for a long time, and now more than ever this past couple of years, it can be daunting. Yes, it's fulfilling.
Yes.
But it's often thankless work and lonely work when we're facing the forces that appear to be not about connecting, not about healing. The sources of trauma in our world seem to be increasing almost daily. So for your persistence and for your creation of something that looks to be really potent to help us face this stuff, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. I mean, it has been a very humbling journey, but you're right. You can't do what you're doing, what I'm doing, without, I say I have battle wounds that are well hidden. But when you decide to do something differently in the world, it's not always embraced. But I think that what I'm hearing from you, and certainly in my own journey in this life, is I do feel like there's a higher purpose and why I'm doing this. And that's what keeps me going. And it is, I think, that sacred path that Joseph Campbell talked about,
Mm.
that sometimes is beyond our comprehension, in this kind of incredible universal unconsciousness that is, is also goodness as well as the darkness that we also see right now.
Yeah, it does. It does appear that we might just be in a collective dark night of the soul, or possibly hero's journey if things turn out well.
The hero's journey. Well, I have, somebody posted on Facebook uh, something today about, as hard as this year has been. They also mentioned a number of things that our former president, Obama, had posted on his Facebook page today, which is 3 acts of generosity and kindness that came out of some of the darkness. And I think that it's important for us to pay attention to that. And, I think there's one more thing, if you would let me say. We had a wonderful community resiliency model skills teacher in Portland, Oregon, Melissa Fox, who suddenly died 3 days ago. And I just want to say something, just that she was an amazing woman that spoke up for people who had no voice. And she is part of that person, although this physical journey is over for her, that she lives in my heart of one of those individuals on this earth that spoke to truth and generosity. And I just hope that I can, imbue that, embed that inside of me in her memory going forward. So I'm just remembering Melissa Fox of Portland, Oregon, as we end our call.
Well, thank you. That's very, very beautiful of you to share that. And I just recall Joanna Macy's quote, that the heart that is broken open can hold the entire universe. So thank you for sharing your broken open heart and
so much.
Allowing a little bit of grief to be shared.
Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to further conversation.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. You may want to check out our sister podcasts, the new Lifeboat Hour with Carolyn Baker on Podbean and at carolynbaker.net. Also, the Impossible Conversation podcast, another channel on YouTube. Thanks so much for joining us. Join us again later for another episode of the Poetry of Predicament.